Hello, I'm Santier, and today I want to talk about narratives, I guess. This is talking about how we kind of work through life, or kind of how we interact with things. Basically, I'm going to do some introspection in some of my own reactions to things, with some distance and time to reflect and think about my response to them and why I was thinking the way and responding the way that I was. So what I'm going to be looking at specifically is kind of a retrospective on some of my thoughts and the narratives that I was holding to during the whole Kavanaugh-Ford thing. Sorry to bring this whole thing up again, but I think that the retrospective that I've been able to obtain after it has some merit to go over. Hopefully that doesn't sound too arrogant. So one of the things is, to give you a picture of where I was at the time, I was very much so in the Kavanaugh camp, where I wanted him to be vindicated and all of that sort of thing. I believed him to be innocent, and in retrospect, as I've kind of reflected on that, I don't know enough about it to really make a call per se 100%. But what I'm not so much concerned about what the outcome should be or should have been or any of those sorts of things. I want to know why I wanted a particular outcome. Why did I want this? Why did I believe certain narratives? So there are certain narratives that I believed. I believed, for example, that everybody was against him, which is clearly untrue. A ton of people were for him. I believed the narrative that, he's up against the wall, and all of these people are against him, and his life's going to be ruined, and all sorts of things. And it's like, when I step back and reflect on it, what I have fallen into is I've fallen into the sort of group narrative that a certain political side, uses all the time. And I think to some extent both sides use the other side as more powerful. I can't really speak to the position of the left because I tend to view things more through a right lens, even though politically I'm probably more on the left than I am on the right, just because of how I grew up. And so I'm more in tune with the narrative from the right, regardless of what sort of views I actually end up holding. And the narrative is very much so that the left is in power, they control the media, they can ruin somebody's career, that they have a lot of power in a lot of these political systems. And that, particularly more in the social atmosphere, because of the belief that the left has control over the news media, which is clearly incorrect given how popular Fox News is and how popular talk radio is. To think that the right has no voice in that area is clearly incorrect. But it's the narrative they tell themselves. And that means that view, as I was saying, that I very much so was entrenched in, is that the left was going to try to destroy this guy, and that for him to win is like an uphill battle and against all odds, which I don't really think that it is in retrospect now. But there's an element of like vindication in that. And the reason why I held to that is in part because I was so stuck in that narrative that I didn't have the broader perspective to be able to see sort of the ridiculousness of it on its face, that in reality, a lot of people were supporting him. A lot of people believed him. There wasn't nobody believing him. A lot of people did. He had a lot of support. And I'm emphasizing that because I didn't understand the truth of it, the fact of it. And I had bought into the narrative that everyone was against him when clearly that's false. And so we do this sort of thing where we build up narratives, that we go along with, that we believe in. And I also was reflecting some on why did I so want him to be vindicated or shown to be innocent. It's because the situation that was presented to me that he was in, i.e., from his point of view, that he was being falsely accused of a crime that he couldn't realistically do a very good job of defending himself against, because how can you? That people were disbelieving him, again, from that narrative perspective, that everyone disbelieved him, which is, again, clearly false, but that everyone disbelieved him, and that, how could he possibly defend himself? How can he defend himself? And even if he made a defense, no one would listen, no one would believe him. Again, this was the narrative that I was holding to, which at this point I can clearly see as preposterous. But that narrative made me on his side because it echoes and plays to fears that I have of that very situation. One of the bigger fears that I have is the fear of unjust judgment. That is where somebody judges me unfairly, where I am not allowed to give my say and I'm not heard, where I'm just ignored and judged and condemned. And I don't like that situation. I'm scared of that situation. And so what he went through, in terms of the narrative presented to me of what he went through, speaks to one of my deeper fears, one of my stronger fears. And that made me want to see him get a win, as it were, to overcome that fear, to see that it's possible for somebody to walk through that and come through, maybe not entirely unscathed, but at least successfully. And that whole process of what he went through, that, again, narratively, and this is what I'm talking about, like, he had a lot of supporters. He had a lot of people that believed him. And realizing the truth of that helps with that fear, because I can see that, yeah, there might be people who don't believe me, but there will be people who will believe me. And it helps counteract that fear, because I can see, as I step back, wait, no, the way that I understood this was wrong. And therefore, if that situation happens in my own life, I can potentially or likely expect a similar narrative where, in fact, there are people who are on my side and support me. So that's some of the thoughts that I've had afterwards, reflecting on it, as well as when other people have talked about similar sorts of things. And, or, just the idea of how those narratives work and how we paint narratives in that sort of way. So the name that especially comes to mind is ContraPoints, if I'm remembering correctly, which had a very interesting video on free speech that kind of highlighted how we run these narratives in our lives, and we tell ourselves, this is how things are, and it can be very difficult to step back and evaluate if those narratives are true and accurate, or if they're false representations of reality. And part of the issue is we get group narratives that say the same thing, group narratives that say that the left is in control of the universities, group narratives that say they're shutting down conversation, group narratives. You can see the perspective that I'm coming from, even with these narratives that I'm talking about. These are the narratives that I'm familiar with. These are the narratives that I've heard. And there's perhaps a kernel of truth at the corners, but a lot of it is not accurate. And you can see that. You can see that conversations are happening. You can see that discussion is able to occur. And so we have to ask, why are people telling these narratives? And I think that's perhaps a more interesting question. Like, why are people telling that particular narrative? And that's one that I think is going to be an individual case by case, but I think it's because of a sense of who is listening, and I don't know. It's hard to describe exactly, but really these big narratives, these big global narratives, become a real big problem, or national narratives, or these large political party narratives. These are real big problems, because if we believe them down to the individual interactions that we have, this is part of what creates effigies of those who are our opponents, as it were. Not our enemies, our opponents. And that causes us to not be able to interact well, or to be able to further a conversation or a discussion, because both sides of a discussion will shut it down because they don't believe the other side is reasonable. They don't believe the other side will listen, or will talk, or will deal with them fairly, or will give the benefit of the doubt. And fundamentally, they don't believe the other side will listen to them, will believe them. This shuts down conversation more than any particular other action. It's the effigy of the other side that our side paints in any given social conflict. And we need to try to fight against succumbing to those. Otherwise, we're not really going to be able to have a conversation. We're just going to pick sides, and we're going to shout at each other. So anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Again, I'm not quite sure what to call this topic. Vicarious narratives, something like that maybe. I guess you'll find out. Until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.